Jacques, legally speaking, is Taiwan a country?
Well, that's a tougher question than it sounds like. Taiwan has a good case for satisfying the criteria for statehood, for being a country under international law. The classic standards are that there be a distinct population, a distinct territory, that within that territory and among those people, it's self-governing in the sense of not being a component government in a larger state. And that it has the capacity to engage in international relations. That last prong is sort of the stickiest because, of course, Taiwan has relatively limited formal diplomatic ties with the governments of other states, but it has a very robust international presence. It's got informal representation in many countries around the world. It's a member of many important international organizations, and it has a degree of participation in others. The other piece that arguably is a weak point is that many contested states, disputed states, very openly declare we are a state. They have the equivalent of the American July 4th, 1776 moment. Taiwan hasn't done that, but what Taiwan has done increasingly, or Taiwanese leaders have done increasingly over the last few decades, is to insist increasingly strongly that Taiwan, or the Republic of China on Taiwan, is a sovereign independent state without sort of declaring the moment about when that occurred.
And you talked about the diplomatic allies. So this would explain why China obviously has been trying to poach those allies from Taiwan.
Yes, that's right. And we've seen a gradual erosion of the number of states that maintain formal diplomatic ties with the Republic of China versus the People's Republic. That's been shifting steadily since the 1970s. And since 2016, China has resumed poaching those diplomatic allies so that Taiwan is now down to the very low double digits. But it's not at all clear that you need formal diplomatic recognition to meet the criterion of engaging in international relations. There's a quite strong argument that informal participation will do.
A key component of China's argument to take Taiwan is that Taiwan has always been a part of China and it's an inseparable part.
Well, of course, many in Taiwan would dispute that Taiwan was ever part of China. So you get the argument from some Taiwanese that it never really was, or that at least it has not been for a very long time. It was never more than lightly ruled. And you can look through the history of Portuguese, Dutch, and Japanese presence, particularly Japanese colonialism from 1895 to 1945. You can look back to the time of Kashinga or Zhengchenggong, which was separately ruled, and all of that sort of pushes back against the Chinese claim. But China makes several different claims. Beijing makes several different claims to the effect of Taiwan being part of China, and you just point to the strongest of them, or at least the most assertive of them, not the most credible, but the most assertive, which says that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China and has always been part of China. Now that requires looking away from much of the history that I just mentioned. It also, in particular, requires rejecting some of the events that would have seemed to have separated Taiwan from China if it ever was part of China. So in the mainland view, the 1895 treaty with Japan, which handed Taiwan over to Japan, made it a Japanese colony, was an unequal treaty. It was void from the beginning. And these days, we would object to treaties that transfer territory and sovereignty through coercion because of a war. But that wasn't the rule back in the 19th century. It was okay to do that. The other argument that China makes about how that treaty could have made no difference is that it's an unequal treaty in the sense that it was substantively unfair to China. It violated Chinese sovereignty. And so if you take this view, for the Chinese view that says Taiwan was an inalienable part of China that never left, then that treaty made no difference, and nothing that happened since, including 75 years, the most recent 75 years or so of separate rule, the period of Japanese colonialism before that. In the Chinese view, none of that can change some unbreakable reality that Taiwan always has been, always must be, and can never not be part of China. That's a pretty hard argument to make under conventional international legal thinking.
There are, plenty of examples of other countries where this has been the case.
There are, of course, many cases where we've rearranged sovereignty. It happens a lot in modern European history. We had the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It broke up. Austrians and Germans have a lot in common. They were once under one sovereignty, then they weren't. Americans, Canadians, Brits obviously have historical ties and were at one point all under one sovereignty, but now they are separate countries. There's nothing that says once you are part of one sovereign state, that must be how it is forever. And indeed, one of the reasons we don't look back and overturn treaties which were affecting sovereignty and which were the result of war and coercion is because we can't read today's rules back into those earlier times, or we'd wind up just jumbling borders, moving people around in ways that are just too destabilizing.
Taiwan has been ruled independently, self-governed for 75 years, as you said. Previous to that, it was a colony of Japan, formerly. So if there had been loose form of imperial Chinese presence on the island before that, does that give China the basis to threaten to annex Taiwan?
Well, no, those kinds of historical ties, if you do not accept that Taiwan is currently part of China and is trying to secede, trying to get away, if you don't grant that premise, that's the PRC premise, the premise from Beijing, certainly not the premise from Taiwan. But if you don't accept that it would be an attempted secession, then it doesn't create a basis. It would, in fact, be taking over a separate entity. It would be a violation of the rules concerning use of force to affect territorial change. So, I mean, it really depends on how you phrase this thing.
And the CCP often cites the fact that there are very strong cultural ties between the Chinese and the Taiwanese as another piece of the argument to say that Taiwan is part of China. What do you make of that?
Well, again, the fact that two groups of people have significant ethnic, linguistic, cultural, historical ties does not mean that they must be part of the same state. It may make it more feasible, more appealing that they are, but it's certainly not required. And again, we see lots of cases where what arguably would be one people live on opposite sides of borders between states. The way that the sort of identity issues that we're talking about here factor in is a little bit differently. That is, to the extent that Taiwanese, after 75 years of separate rule, have begun to identify themselves as Taiwanese distinct from mainland Chinese, then they start to look like a separate Taiwanese people. Now, obviously, it's a somewhat multicultural and multi-ethnic place even. The distinction between so-called mainlanders and so-called Taiwanese has faded over time. There's still some indigenous Australasian peoples and so on. But to the extent that the people who live on Taiwan start to think of themselves as Taiwanese and not Chinese, and we all know the polling on that's rather complicated, then the argument becomes that the Taiwanese people have an international legal right to self-determination, which can include getting a separate state, even if they don't already have one. It's one of the few bases in international law that makes secession permissible. On the other hand, if it already is a separate state, which is a separate sovereign entity, which is the way the Taiwanese and Taiwanese leaders describe Taiwan, then that really doesn't enter into it because, again, it's perfectly permissible for people with lots of ties to live on opposite sides of state borders, to live in two different states.